Hello, and welcome to the book launch for John Foster's Realism and the Climate Crisis. I'm Emily Watt. I'm John's commissioning editor at the Bristol University Press, and I'm delighted to introduce John, a freelance philosopher and honorary teaching fellow at Lancaster University, and his fellow speaker, Rupert Reed, who's an associate professor of philosophy at the University of East Anglia. Just a bit of background, I was first in touch with John in late 2020 when he sent me his outline. And although John acknowledged that there were other climate-related hope books published and probably likely more to come, it was his unique argument and passion which caught my eye. The book argues distinctly for a deeper realism of transformation, which comes at the price of accepting that our condition is tragic. He calls for more of a more revolutionary approach to the demands of the climate emergency, and goes beyond what most and argues that we should go beyond what most activists have so far adopted. The book asks important questions, and as it states in the blurb, this is certainly a book that will make you think with, to argue and disagree with, and to hope with. John and Rupert will talk for about half an hour, and after that, I'll put your questions to them so they can. So please use that Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. If you have any technical issues, please just use the chat, let us know, and we'll try to resolve those. So questions in the Q&A and issues in chat, if you can keep it that way, we'll make sure we don't miss anything. And details of how to order the book at 50% discount will be available in the chat too, and a recording of the webinar will be available after the event. So without delay, I'm going to hand you over to the speakers.
Thanks, Emily. So we've decided that I'll go first because I'm going to ask John one or two questions about his book. So yeah, as you've heard, my name is Rupert Reed. Some of you may be familiar with my work. I worked alongside John for a while in the Greenhouse think tank. And I think it's fair to say there's been a strong debate and dialogue between us across the years, which I'm delighted is ongoing and I would say strengthening. And I'm delighted to be here to talk about this absolutely important, really, really compelling book, Realism and the Climate Crisis, Hope for Life, that John has written. I think it's probably John's best book yet, and that's saying a lot. I've written reviews of his previous books, and they've been very laudatory. I'm saying the same kind of thing about this book, but even more so, I think this book has a kind of a quality of compellingness and importance, which John hadn't achieved previously, and virtually nobody had. So, that's why I'm giving it such a high ranking. Why do I say that? I'm going to try to say something very brief about that, but as the saying goes, really you have to read the book. So this is all by way of saying do avail yourself of that 50% discount, folks. It's well worth it. That's quite a discount. Basically what John is saying is that there is something in us which he argues, and I've got some questions about this, but he argues quite powerfully is deeper than morality, which is compelling us to respond on an absolutely full spectrum basis without any holds barred to the climate crisis. And that something is life itself. It is basically the life force within us, an upwelling, endless life force. I think this is actually quite close to what I'm interested in around the concept of eco-spirituality, which is something an angle we might discuss this from. In philosophical terms, we could, it seems to me, also think of it in another way that John also doesn't describe it as, but that is philosophically very interesting. And that would be as a new kind of cogito, a new version of the argument which Descartes famously comes up with. He says, look, how do I know I exist? Well, I think I have the thought, how do I know that I exist, therefore I exist? Or more succinctly, I think, therefore I am. And at page 147 of his book, I'm just going to quote here, John says something which is, I think, intriguingly similar to this. He says, "What most deeply matters for me reflects not what I find myself happening to will, such that I could have willed otherwise or on a different pattern and still have been the same self, but what nothing could have failed to will and still have been this living subjectivity, following this particular clue of spontaneous exfoliation. A living consciousness, in other words, finally cannot step back in reflection from life itself." So it's as if John is saying something like, what proves the importance of the life force is the life force itself, and you can't get away from that in reflecting on it. Life itself, experienced from within as individual perspectival energy, ceaselessly emerging and pressing forward through and as me, and also intuitively recognized as an active principle which we share with everything else. So, I mean, you'll already have the sense, I hope, that there is such an immensity of riches in this book. And I'm going to say something about this event that we're at here this afternoon, which is a book launch. And that's super. But book launches are notoriously brief. So we're only going to be here for an hour or so. And I think really we should regard this book launch as just a promissory note for something much more substantial. Really, this book needs to have some kind of serious symposium on it. There are so many philosophical and ecological and political and moral issues that it raises that deserve a thorough discussion. So I hope that that promissory note will be made good on at some point. Now, before I hand over to John for his initial words and response, I'm going to raise the first of my concerns about the book, because he wouldn't want anything less. And that concern, I'm going to express, and he may well find this a sympathetic thought, actually, by way of saying that I thought that there was something at times which held back from the full difficulty of our predicament, in the way that John says climate change is not a problem, it's not a wicked problem, it's not a super wicked problem, it's something even more extreme than that. It's a new tragic condition that we're in. I think that's basically right, and we could explore that concept of tragedy more. But he also talks about it as an emergency that we're in. And I've come to believe recently that the frame of emergency is itself inadequate, is itself too close to being to regarding something as like a problem or even a wicked problem, because an emergency is essentially something that one somehow imagines could at some point come to an end, and that is not the condition that we are in. This is a new, essentially permanent condition. What we actually need to do, it seems to me, and as I say, John might well just agree with this, is to emerge from the sick condition that we are in at the present time. But that emerging will be not emerging from the condition of an emergency into something beyond it. Therefore, what we are in is not really an emergency. It's much worse than that. It's a full spectrum challenge to our philosophy and to ourselves and to our time. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to John, and we're going to initiate here a bit of a back and forth conversation before we go over to you all. John.
Well, thank you, Rupert. It's interesting to hear one's own words quoted back like that. I'd forgotten that bit. And thank you too for joining me here and for, as it were, taking thought about this book. Rupert wouldn't want to be called a co-author of this, but he's certainly an inspirer of it. The way that I've interacted with his writing over a good many years now has been quite transformative for me. And so I'm particularly grateful and indeed honoured to have him put me on the spot here about this book. The question about whether this is an emergency is a very interesting one. I must confess that in thinking ahead for the purposes of this afternoon's discussion, it's not one that had crossed my mind, but now that Rupert's made it cross my mind, I think the way I would respond is to say an emergency sounds as if it's something that's ideally temporary, that it's something that we can get through one way or another and perhaps then get back to something like normality. And I think the whole tenor of what I've written is contrary to that. The climate emergency obviously has to be addressed and dealt with, and as far as possible, we have to reduce the impacts of the various upcoming disasters that are already in the pipeline, and we have to work in the space between disaster and catastrophe to prevent the latter. But it is also about an epochal shift, I think, in our understanding of ourselves. It needs to be, if we are to have any hope at all of dealing with it, even as an emergency. We have to get a new sense of what the human condition is, what our scope is, what we can do with our aspirations, which of our values are compatible with which. We have to change the way of thinking about all those things which has come down to us from the Enlightenment over the last couple of 100 years and has been, in part productive of the crisis and is certainly productive of our difficulties in dealing with it. So we are talking about something on a much larger scale than, as it were, simply getting through an emergency and back to normal. The model is not the pandemic. The model is something much more demanding than that.
Yes.
And that's why I lay so much stress on the nature of hope and the kind of realism that has to be involved in any plausible hoping that is available to us now. But none of that is to say that the climate crisis hasn't to be addressed.
No, of course not.
And it is vital to think about the extremely challenging conditions under which we have now got to address it. I mean, a quotation that struck me in The Guardian a few days ago, and The Guardian's first leader commenting on the IPCC impact report that's just come out. The Guardian says, the idea of a gentle transition away from fossil fuels towards low carbon alternatives no longer seems realistic.
Yes.
I mean, it doesn't begin to hint at what a non-gentle transition would be, but that it has, the mainstream goes as far as saying that is, I think, sufficiently striking now. What I'm trying to do in the book is to indicate, as it were, what a non-gentle transition might look like and might involve.
Yeah, good. Thanks, John. I thought you might give an answer roughly like that, and I was hoping that you would. So I take one consequence of that to be that in those places, and there's only a few places actually, but in those places in the book where you talk about the climate emergency, actually that should at least be sort of reframed or reread in the kind of way you've just sketched. And what this means is that the standard way in which we come to use this term climate emergency is actually pretty deeply misleading. I mean, it was a wonderful gambit to try to get, and I've been part of it, to try to get people to up their urgency on the crisis. But actually, at the end of the day, it makes the whole thing sound too easy. And that's one of the things that your book is very, very good at doing, making the whole thing sound as difficult as it is while still being possible, and resisting the endless temptations that people have to make it sound easier than it really is. So at the end of the day, talking about a climate emergency or climate and ecological emergency, awesome though it sounds, is actually to make the thing sound too easy. And what we're trying to do is actually even harder than that. I mean, for me, what this is about really is about fully facing reality, which is a frame that you touch upon a couple of times in the book. And it's summed up in this title here, of course, Facing Up to Climate Reality, this wonderful book edited by a certain John Foster for Greenhouse. And what I take you to be doing in the book is showing how the disappearance of ordinary kind of traditional hopes, including for a smooth transition, or for us to be able to get back to normal, or for the climate problem to be solved, how all of this is completely missing the point and is actually anesthetizing us. What we have to do is to face the situation where those ordinary hopes, those empirical hopes, as you call them, are gone, where we decisively leave behind wishful thinking. And part of what it is to fully face reality is to face, for example, how many people are so deeply invested in those false hopes and in that wishful thinking. And when you really do that, it makes things incredibly hard, because like loads of people who are, roughly speaking, on our side are still thoroughly invested in these fake hopes and in this wishful thinking, magical thinking, so-called stubborn optimism, etc. And we have to include the idea that all of that can be overcome, and the difficulty of doing that if we're to get anywhere. And the way we do that, I think, and this is again drawing on but going beyond what you specifically and explicitly say in the book, I think of it as a kind of dialectic of hope. And what I mean by that is that we fully face reality. We face how seemingly impossible our situation is. We face the number of people even on our side who are not willing to fully face up to that. And we lose our hopes for an easy transition and for this to be dealt with as an emergency and so on and so forth. And all of that actually feeds back into and reinforces the life force, the life hope that you think is, and I think you're basically right, is deep within us. In other words, we think, what's it going to take, given all of those things, for us to be able to actually get anywhere on this? And the answer is, it's going to take something utterly unprecedented. It's going to take an extraordinary, as yet almost undreamt of, kind of level of courage and wisdom and determination. It's going to take the kind of authenticity that we've seen in Extinction Rebellion and in Greta Thunberg, multiplied by several orders of magnitude. I think we've seen glimpses of what is needed in Greta and in XR, but only glimpses. I think we need something far stronger and more resolute and more outrageous, perhaps, and more courageous even than that. And that's an enormous ask, but that is the ask. That is the ask that Life Hope makes. So what that then implies is we have to try to rise to that challenge. We have to try to rise to that kind of level. And well, that's just how it is. That's what we have to do. That is the task that you are laying down for us.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Greta Thunberg. Thunberg, I believe is how you say her name in Swedish, but Thunberg. Greta says, I don't want you to be, famously says, I don't want you to be hopeful, I want you to panic. And obviously that makes a lot of sense, where hopefulness is a sort of, glib way of dodging the reality of the situation, the sort of stuff that you get bandied about in international conferences and things. Hopium, I believe you've called it in print. But it's also true, and this is where I found it, where this has come out of my own life in a way, that any activist will concede that you have to have something along the lines of hope just to keep going in the situation as it is. And that's hope as a sort of life energy that you know is prepared, gets you prepared to get out of bed in the morning and just keep on at whatever, you know, your particular piece of activism or line of activism is. And it applies, I have to say, just as much to writing about this stuff as to going out on the streets and doing whatever might get you arrested. But hope has to be directed at something with a real chance of happening in order to count as hope. That's what I call the condition of realism. And if you look at the situation that confronts us, the quite unprecedented situation that confronts us, and the insuperable looking challenge of reducing our emissions by the amount that is necessary in the time that is left to us, you start to think, well, that actually is no longer realistic, and hope starts to drain away. But as you know, as you've pointed out, and as I've used a lot of the book to emphasize, hope and life just go together in the sense that you can't actually, I mean, for me, this came most clearly to the fore of my understanding when my first grandson was born. It sort of spurred me to write this book. And I thought, you know, at the time this little lad's my age, what's the world going to be like? And you just cannot step back from hope in those circumstances. But if you're honest about the unprecedented, insuperable odds, empirically insuperable odds that we confront, hope has to be hope against hope. It has to be hope invested in transformative change, which is by definition against the odds. Now, sometimes hoping like that can give things a chance of happening that would not happen without such hope. But the condition of realism still applies. And if that sort of hope means, oh, well, maybe the next cop will do the job, you know, if it means shunting the last chance saloon car constantly on down the track without it's ever hitting any buffers, then it's another form of self-delusion. And that is why I get to the point of saying such hope has to be explicitly counter-utopian. It's got to be about recognizing, it's got to be held, it's got to be relied on, it's got to be exercised in the context where we recognize that our situation is tragic. And then what does that mean in terms of, you know, the non-gentle transition that The Guardian is now beginning to recognize is necessary? And it means some quite frightening things, I think, in sort of political and social terms. And I'm sure you'll want to come on to question me about those.
Yeah. So I think we should get to those.
This is where we don't agree.
Yeah, well, we should get to those in just a moment. Just before we do, just kind of more directly on that. Actually, I've lost my thread slightly. Give me a second. Yes, the question that is implicit in what you just said, and that is explicit in the book, is hope for what? Because far too often what people do when they say, we want hope, give us more hope, etc., is for people like you and me to tell them basically everything's going to be okay. And the plain fact of the matter is that everything is not going to be okay. And there are lots of things that we have to give up hope for. So we have to give up hope for a smooth transition. We have to give up hope for a cop to sort it all out. We have to give up hope for being able to mitigate our way out of this and not do a huge amount of transformative adaptation. And what you also add in the book is that we have to give up hope for utopian solutions where we're going to parlay change to our climatic situation into completely generalized social justice and the best of all possible worlds. And only if we give up all of those hopes, only if we give up all of those hopes, do we have a chance of being able to hope realistically for the things that we actually most desperately need.
Yes, I mean, hope at bottom now, in the circumstances that we're in, has to be for a continuingly viable biosphere. It has to be for the viability of the human species and a whole lot of other species too, in conditions which we are at the moment very rapidly eroding.
Yeah.
Beyond that, I think one of the real difficulties about recognizing that hope has to be for transformative change is recognizing that we don't actually know in what conditions that will come about. We don't know what we will feel about those conditions. We don't know what values we can carry through into those new conditions. We have to explore, we have to create as we go forward. So, I mean, I think Hope for Life is the subtitle of the book. And to me, that's essential.
Yes.
We have to ensure that life goes on, generation by generation, in exactly the kind of way that you've talked about in your book, Parents for a Future, which was an important point of reference for me in thinking about these issues. And if you like, we have to take whatever is involved in working for those hopes along with it.
Yes.
And if that means radically different forms of society, economy, political organization, so be it.
Yes, absolutely. And this is one crucial point where you and I agree, John, and where you go even further than I do. And this can become quite uncomfortable in progressive circles, leftist circles, green circles, to be willing to question the assumption that we're going to be able to hold on to all our Enlightenment values and do stuff that is completely seemingly morally unchallengeable, and actually rise to the challenges which are going to confront us. And this, again, is a crucial aspect of what you call realism. And that perhaps takes us to possibly the most important area where we disagree. As I said in the opening of this session here this afternoon, we could talk, well, literally for days about this, and I hope that we will. And there are various, philosophical issues I'd love to discuss with you in the book. And I've got questions around your commitment, which I still think is a bit stronger than it should be, to individualism. And I think maybe you don't state as clearly as you might that actually when you're criticizing moralism or morality as being part of the solution, a lot of the time what you're really criticizing, I think, is consequentialism, not necessarily other versions such as virtue ethics. But we've got limited time, so I want us to turn to the question which is implicit in what you just said, which is what is to be done. And basically, for those who haven't had a chance yet to read John's book, he propounds what I think it's fair to call a form of eco-Leninism or climate Leninism in the book, and says we need a vanguard party which will make very few concessions to squeamishness or concerns about ends and means, in pursuing ruthlessly the agenda of saving life. And to be blunt, you basically say at a couple of points, this is probably going to require violence. Of course, there are questions around the definition of violence. I would argue, for example, that property damage should not normally be counted as violence, but I think you do go on beyond that to say it's likely to need also violence involving interpersonal relations, which is where things get very tricky. You seem to suggest that the violence might only be defensive rather than offensive. Maybe we should explore that. Basically, what you're propounding in the book is a very uncompromising version of what in the movement theory discourse is called radical flank style approaches. You're going further than Roger Hallam goes, and you're probably pretty close to Andreas Malm, who's made a bit of a hit recently with books with titles like How to Blow Up a Pipeline. And, it's compellingly argued, given my background as a Quaker and someone who helped launch Extinction Rebellion, was very active in that, people will probably be unsurprised to hear that I'm not in agreement with going as far as that. There are various arguments I would adduce here, but probably the most significant one is the simple pragmatic argument that I don't think it's going to work. The question I would like to ask at this point is, how many people do we need in order to make the transformation that you speak about rightly? And you seem to assume that we actually only need a fairly small vanguard in order to successfully do this. But I think the situation is very, very different from the situation that Lenin created and inherited, because the climate transformation is going to require significant life changes for everybody, basically. And that implies to me that we're going to need a quite large degree of consent in order to be able to actually get there. And that's part of the reason why I've argued recently for a moderate flank approach as opposed to a radical flank approach. And moderate flank here means moderate relative to Extinction Rebellion and Greta. It means exploiting the space that they have opened up, especially in a country like the UK. So I would argue that your strategy has got some pretty serious hostages to fortune, that there isn't much evidence that there are as yet anywhere near enough people to actually make it possible, and that the number of people that it could get, even if it was instantiated, would almost certainly be too low to bring about the kind of system transformation that we actually need. So that's why I'm not convinced by your proposals towards the end of the book. And I'd put it to you that perhaps the best thing for revolutionaries to do might be to form and lend their weight to moderate flank type organizations, which could go further than the traditional NGOs and go further than the Green Party and so on, but not go as far as you want to go. What do you say, John?
Well, I'll respond as quickly as I can, because I know that these issues will be coming up in discussion that people will want to move on to quickly. But let me put it like this. Who are the sort of people who are going to find that their sense of life responsibility makes complicity in a biocidal system simply intolerable? Just to recognize their situation, they will need to be intelligent, to understand the issues and the upshot of the science. They'll need to be imaginative enough to make the consequences vivid in their own minds. They'll need to be reflective enough to appreciate the implications for their own lives. On top of that, to do anything, they'll need honesty, so as not to lie to, most importantly, themselves, but not to lie to others either. And they will need courage to act on their convictions in the face of massive collective apathy and disincentive. Now, people combining all these qualities will always be a small minority of any population, but firstly, this minority needs to come to power in 20 years or we're stuffed. Secondly, they are likely to comprise a functionally crucial minority. They'll come from the ranks of lawyers, administrators, managers, serving officers, scientists, some engineers and entrepreneurs, educators, students, caring professionals, creative people. Now, and across the board, you know, climate strike, withdrawal of labour, withdrawal of consent by this potential cohort of the responsibly intelligent, properly coordinated and actively pursued for a fortnight, would stop the fossil fuel state in its tracks. And what I'm arguing at the back end of the book is that the principal role of climate activists now is to bring such a cohort into being and act as its leading vanguard. Now, all that trades on stuff about hope and stuff about tragedy in ways which I'm sure we'll go on to talk about. But that's the case. And I haven't seen alternative proposals that convince me any more than that does. I mean, it's a long shot. Then anything now is a long shot.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I think, I mean, Emily has been signaling for a while that perhaps we should stop now and see what questions people who've joined us have got to put to me or to either of us.
You sense that very well, John. There are quite a few questions that have come through already. So, I mean, I'll let me just get those up. First, I just wanted to ask you, can we hope to avoid tragic outcomes from the present emergency, do you think? Or do you feel like you've answered that in your talk already?
I think possibly we've touched on it, but let me be absolutely explicit. The answer is no. Accepting that tragic outcomes are on the way is the only realism now that I think could sustain hope, because you have to be honest about the extent to which we have messed this up. Humanity has messed this up. Tragic means that there are grievous conflicts of values involved in whatever we do, and I think that is just now unignorable. So no, we can't hope to avoid tragic outcomes from the present emergency or the present situation. What we can hope to do is to operate in the space between tragedy, disaster, which is now inevitable of various kinds, and catastrophe, which is final and absolute and is still not necessarily going to happen. Depends on us.
Yes. So you talk about hope just then. One of the questions, which is quite a long question, so I won't read it all. So it's about someone who is an active researcher researching the philosophy of hope, and what they've discovered is that the vast majority of academics who invoke hope do not necessarily know what they're talking about, because maybe they haven't researched it in such depth. So some people may have an attitude of, I hope, so I know what hope is. So they wonder whether your book is any different. Are you talking about hope and despair, or do you simply use words hope and despair to get, to sound passionate and forthright in your argument, and appeal to a specific audience? And then they have a follow-up question, so I'll let you just feel free to answer that. There's quite
sure. I'm deeply, having spent something like 30 years in academia, I'm deeply sympathetic to the idea of academics not knowing what they're talking about. Let me put myself on the line here. What do I mean by hope? In the book, I call it future-directed desire under the sign of contingency. In other words, hope is about something you want to happen, And I think this is this is conceptually a correct analysis of the concept of hope. Hope is about something you want to happen, think has a chance of happening, but recognize also to have a significant chance of not happening. In other words, hope requires you to invest, as it were, both in the courage of going forward and the courage of accepting risk, but it also requires you to have some sense that what is being hoped for is or can be brought by your own action within the bounds of possibility. Now, as Rupert said early on, I think that hope thought of like that taps into something very deep within us. It is a manifestation of the energy that keeps people going. It is a manifestation of the energy of life. It doesn't always have to be hope for something. I mean, hope doesn't have to have an intentional object. You can hear hope, just hope generalizes a state of mind in Beethoven's music. You can see it in Rembrandt's painting. There's all sorts of manifestations of hope that don't have an intentional object, but hope in the context in which I'm talking and writing about it is hope for the continuation of some form of a viable biosphere and a viable human civilization, transformed from what we've got, but nevertheless, continuing into the foreseeable future. And then the book is about what the conditions for that sort of hope entail. I mean, I hope that that is sufficiently in tune with what the questioner's studies of the philosophy of hope have led him or her to see as the essence of the concept. If not, let's hear some more from them.
So a slightly different question. It's International Women's Day today, and someone has asked, and we have many women leading the climate movement. Can you comment on how you see the role of women in what needs to happen?
I see the role of women as an important part of the sort of vanguard that I was describing before we moved into the question and answer session. There's both men and women are capable of displaying the qualities that are needed to be part of that vanguard. And I mean, I suppose I might at this point say something about, women are more attuned to the force of ongoing life than men, but I have to confess I don't actually believe that. I think that, women and men both are in touch with the deep energies of life if they want to be. And I haven't really got anything interesting to say about, I certainly don't say anything at all in the book about gender differences in relation to these issues. I think these issues transcend gender differences, and it's important to recognise that there are things which do.
Yes. one other question that came through is,
Rupert actually might want to say something about it.
Oh yes, did you want to say anything, Rupert?
I just added something in the, I've just answered it in text form, which people can look at. I don't have much to add. Okay.
One question that caught my eye. Could you please tell us a bit more on the tragic condition humanity is now supposed to be in from a moral point of view? Is ethical decision making essentially altered in the climate crisis?
Here's an example. I discuss this example in the book, but only quite briefly. But I think it's a cogent one. So a lot of the talk from a moral template about the climate crisis and how we respond to it is on the theme of justice. Justice in respect of future generations, intragenerational justice, justice between historically big emitting nations and nations that haven't contributed to this problem at all, and all that. What is justice going to be in what the philosopher Tim Mulgan calls a broken world, a world in which essentially there are resource bottlenecks, in which there are not enough resources to go round. And so crudely, some people are going to get them and some people aren't. So that as it were, the political issue, classically who gets what and says who, becomes who dies and who lives and says who.
Yes.
Now, on a justice model, what do? Well, perhaps you have a lottery, a survival lottery. People pick a straw and they either get a package of resources that will see them through or they don't. But nobody's going to buy that. If justice means putting my kids into a survival lottery along with a lot of strangers, then to hell with justice. Yeah? We're going to have to reinvent justice for a broken world of resource bottlenecks. And this comes back to the point that I was making earlier about the need to recognize that, as it were, we're in the process of rediscovering what our values are going to need to be. I don't know whether that is addressing the question as concerns. If not, they can come back. But I think that's what I would say off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you. One other question, and this is a related question that follows from someone else as well. Even the stubborn optimists believe in transformation, such as our energy sources. What do you mean specifically by transformation, as it's clearly not the same? And then a later question is about transformation. Can there be transformation in one country? So,
may I have a go at these?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Rupert has published stuff.
Let Rupert speak.
Yeah, this is very much my field these days. So I think they're both really great questions. On the first question about the stubborn optimists, Cristina Figueres et al., believing in transformation in our energy sources, my response would be that really isn't transformation at all, because what that is attempting to imagine is that we basically perpetuate the system that we currently have, only we've got a different energy source for it. There's absolutely no reason to believe that that's possible. Moreover, it would be awful in all sorts of ways, even if it were to be possible, because of course there's huge amounts that's terribly wrong with our world that's not even encompassed within the climate frame at all. So I think that the perspective here really is very different from the stubborn optimist. Perspective is for something much more genuinely transformative. It's for system change. It would involve, for example, massive relocalization. John talks in a really interesting way towards the end of the book about land conscription for food security, which I think is a very good phrase. I think to get that, we would need large-scale non-violent direct action, which was aiming positively at that. And for that reason, I think that this book is a very important book. If you've got any budget left after John's, The Book of Trespass by Nick Hayes. I don't agree with everything in it. I think he's facile when he talks about open borders, for example. But the book's main ground is brilliant. When he stands on the ground, basically what Nick Hayes does in that book is he walks around the UK trespassing all over the place, because most of Britain you can't walk in without trespassing, and takes you through the terrible history of property law and appropriation and enclosure of the commons in the UK, etc., and starts getting towards the point of getting people to think, hang on a minute, maybe we really need this land, and we are going to need this land in the time that's coming. I think that land conscription for food security and associated forms of small holding, commonsing, agri-wilding are ideas whose time has very much come. And then in terms of the question of transformation, can it be done in one country? I think that the answer there is sort of yes and no. Obviously, to some extent, it has to be done worldwide. The climate problem is a genuinely global problem, but is it going to be done worldwide? Probably not. Therefore, we've got to get on with it where we live. Also, of course, a lot of what needs to be done, as I say, I think John would agree, will be veering in a direction of radical relocalization. And in that sense, you're actually trying to escape from the overly globalized world that we live in and make it more possible for there to be transformation in one country. So there's a sort of potential kind of virtuous circle there. The more we remake the world to be less fragile and less over-globalized, the more it will be possible for there to be transformation in localities which are not undertaken elsewhere. But at the end of the day, it would be possible for China alone or the USA alone, basically, to sink us climatically. So there are limits to the extent to which we can hope for getting through this without there being a pretty wide waking up of the kind that, of the revolutionary kind, perhaps, that John calls for.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I can just add briefly to that. I mean, I think transformation in political contexts means, the sort of radical shifts that Rupert's just been talking about. At a more philosophical level, transformation, belief in transformation, I take to mean belief that human beings are not limited by their past. They're not determined. They're not bound by, as it were, natural laws derived empirically from what's happened before. Humans are radically free to reinvent themselves and therefore to reinvent their surroundings. And that's an important premise of the argument in the book. We haven't really touched on it very much, but it means a lot to me to think that even though the odds are overwhelmingly against us, human beings are the creatures that can buck the odds. And that is our transformative potential. Now it needs deploying, and to deploy it, it needs the kind of radical activism that I try and argue for towards the end of the book. And it will meet all the difficulties that Rupert was pointing at. But at the core of it, it's to do with recognizing that human beings create possibility. And if we don't believe that, then I think we've got nowhere to go.
Thank you. I think we've got time for maybe one or two quick questions, and then I'll try and wrap it up. Really interesting one that came through. Do you fear that as things get more chaotic, nationalism and xenophobia may rise more, and more as well as the authoritarianism of our governments as they cling to power? I couldn't get the word out.
Yes, and you'd have to have your eyes firmly closed not to, looking around the world as it is. And I take the point, which was made very forcibly to me in one of the reviews of this book that Bristol kindly commissioned, that the sort of, vanguard-led subversion of a failed democratic state, which is what ours is, might well open the way to kinds of exercise of authority that we don't want to see. And that's a serious risk. I don't see any way of avoiding it in the world as it is, but it is definitely a serious risk. And that we are exposed to such risks is a dimension of the tragic nature of the situation.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I would draw attention also to Nadine's helpful remark in the chat, which is relevant to this. I think it's also worth reiterating what I said earlier and what's in John's book, which is that we're not going to be helped, I strongly believe, in addressing this very real risk if we refuse to countenance anything that might conceivably sniff of the kinds of problems that we wish to steer clear of. That might sound a bit abstract. Let me be a bit more concrete. If you're determined that it's absolutely impossible that you could ever conceivably be accused of eco-fascism or of elitism or anything like that, to such an extent that you lean over backwards all the time to be 100% sort of leftist, green, politically correct, imagining that everything's going to be the best of all possible worlds and you're never going to have any remotely dirty hands, then you're dreaming and you're going to be useless to the cause. We're not going to get anywhere, for example, by saying it's obvious that what we should just do now is abolish countries and abolish all borders and let all refugees and all migrants move wherever they want, whenever they want. Saying that is not at all helpful in the current situation. It's fantasy politics.
Thank you, Rupert. One question which came up at the beginning was, and unfortunately I'll have to sort of wrap it up after this, but what do you see the role of education, formal or informal, and across all age ranges being in response to climate catastrophe?
Well, a good one to end with. I mean, Rupert is, and I was, involved with higher education, and indeed I've been quite involved with philosophy work in schools, where I've always tried to bring this dimension into the frame. I mean, I think the role of education is absolutely crucial. The kids who are, out there climate striking are not fools. They realize that unless something is done, something very dramatic and drastic is done, then, their future is something that no one would look forward to. They are spending their time in school and in education preparing for nothing, preparing for a world that is going down the plug hole. One cannot responsibly teach kids about, I think, almost anything these days, possibly pure mathematics, I don't know, without putting it into this sort of frame. And, you know, the fact that a bunch of cut-price desperados like the current British government are trying to, you know, lean on and criminalise teachers who are honest about this stuff is just another example of how broken is the system which we have to tackle. Education is absolutely crucial. The role of teachers is crucial. And it is the next generation who will take this forward if anybody does.
Yeah,
I mean, you know, Greta Thunberg is a role model. What more can you say?
Yeah.
And can I just add to that, that I think that there is a real responsibility here on everyone involved in education, and that's everyone basically, because education isn't just formal education. We have to be truthful, and I think that most of us, most of the time, are still not doing that. We're shielding our children and our teenagers and our students from the truth most of the time. And what my students tell me is they don't want to be shielded, and what the school climate strikers tell us is that they don't want to be shielded. They want to know the truth.
Yeah, my daughter's been learning about David Attenborough and you know, the environmental, you know, his agenda and what he's trying to change, and just from that point of view. So, you know, she gets quite passionate about it when she learns about it, but, you know, it goes all the way through different levels of education. Thank you very much. There are many other questions. Thank you everyone who's asked questions. I'm sorry we haven't managed to get through all of them. We will be able to download those questions from Zoom, so I can still put them to John and Rupert afterwards, and they have seen all the questions as well, so they have engaged with those as we've worked through. So thank you very much. I think you'll agree, this is, I just want to thank John and Rupert for your time. It's been great, and we've covered quite a lot of ground in quite a short amount of time. So I think you agree that this was, you know, fantastic and engaging discussion and a really illuminating event. So thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending and for your time too. The details of how to order have obviously been on the chat, but just to let you know, you can order the paperback book at half price, and it's still available in the chat if you can go back over there and use the code, and which we'll send off to you after the event as well. And there'll be also details about future webinars and book launches found on our website. So I want to say thank you very much. Did you want to say any short closing words before we head off?
I would like to. I'd like to say thank you, Emily. And I'd like to say to everyone, buy the book. 50% off is an incredible deal. It's much more than the booksellers will usually give you. And this book is well worth it. If you can't buy it, get it for your library.
Yes, let me thank Emily as well, and endorse Rupert's last appeal. Equally, I would say if there's anybody who's, you know, got a question which, you know, they're burning to put to me, and we haven't had a chance to get around to it, just make sure that in the chat is an email, and I will do my best to respond to everybody and engage with everybody. I'm grateful to people for the interest they've shown, and thank you all very much.
Yes, everyone's been very engaged in the book, which obviously bodes well. You've obviously stirred things up, and that's part of the aims of your book, I'm sure. So thank you, and the recording will be available afterwards, so if people want to listen in, that'll be there for you. Okay, I will say goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.